I do not like the Call of Duty Zombies Aether Storyline. I've pondered and overanalyzed why I don't like it to such an extent that I've had to rewrite the entire script because I was not wholly satisfied with the conclusions and the points I'd come up with. I've struggled so much to come up with good reasoning because in the beginning, I really loved this story. It's up there as one of my top 10 favourite stories of all time. So how could it simultaneously be one of my most favourite gaming stories, yet also something I don't like? When you invest enough time into something, you eventually gain a feeling that there's no way you can hate it. You affiliate a part of yourself with it, and it makes it difficult to really criticise it, especially when you know so much about it. I felt like this for a very long time, though a persistent sense of disappointment and longing was always not that far behind. This disappointment towards the Aether storyline was born out of multiple factors that occurred throughout the progression of the story, such as at the climax of the Moon map quest and the subsequent story that followed with the Victis crew in Black Ops 2, the ending of Buried and the story premise of Origins, Shadows of Evil and how that linked to Origins, Black Ops 3's ending, which ties up no loose ends, the retroactive reframing of the entire story off-screen after Black Ops 3, and the waning focus on the Aether storyline and the developers' and storytellers' general differences in aspirations. All of this will be explained in the video as to why these elements drew me to the conclusion I expressed right at the start. So sit back and relax as I guide you through why I fell out of love with the Call of Duty Zombies Aether storyline. Before I begin, I recommend you watch this video on the Call of Duty Zombies storyline to refresh your memory, or learn of what it is about. I will not be talking about anything past the ending of Black Ops 4's Tag der Toten, as that's when I completely lost interest in the story. I hope you enjoy, and let's begin. The story from the map Verrückt all the way up until Moon is what got me hooked on the Call of Duty Zombies Aether storyline. Richtofen keeping Dempsey, Takeo, Nikolai, and by extension the player, completely in the dark about his plans to control the hordes of zombies coming after you, was pulled off expertly. The backstory was not too detailed, but well put together enough that you could understand how our playable characters have ended up in the scenario they are currently in, and all of this was explained through hidden radios jotted around the maps. It was an exceptionally unique way to tell a story, which is why it hooked me so easily. I'm telling you all of this because the final map in Black Ops 1, Moon, was the pinnacle of this kind of storytelling. The radios told the story of the events of the map prior to when we arrive, and why the things we are seeing on the map are there. The story quest was mind-blowingly amazing, and had a real lasting impact on the map. We had spent so much time with the characters we were playing up until this point that we had grown attached to them, and were invested in their story. It was disappointing then to go into the next game, Black Ops 2, only to find the focus had shifted onto a new set of characters who were far less interesting in my opinion, and where the story loosely follows on from the events of Moon. The Victis crew were far less important than the characters we had been playing in the grand scheme of the story, only really being made retroactively important later on because the developers and storytellers wanted to wrap things up. I believe the focus should not have shifted away from Takeo, Dempsey, Nikolai, and Samantha after the Moon story. There were plenty of story possibilities that could have followed on from the ending of Moon while focusing on those characters. If you want to see an example of how this would go, skip to the on-screen timestamp or chapter for the alternate story I came up with. Though I do recommend that you continue watching as I explain some things that get solved by my alternate story. To branch away from the characters we were already invested in left little wiggle room for the direction the original story took. Black Ops 2 Zombies plotline is definitively the second worst, and I reckon it could be argued to be the worst part of the entire Aether storyline. Ignoring Mob of the Dead and Origins, each map's story quests follow the same premise, activate a pylon in favour of either Richtofen or Maxis. Depending on who you side with, the ending of the map Buried plays out differently, but the canonical ending is Maxis completely obliterates Earth and reaches Agartha. This was supposed to be the definitive ending to the Aether storyline at the time. However, the looming question that plagued the community was what happened to the Ultimus crew after Moon. Origins, the map after Buried, is where it seems like the developers were attempting to reboot the Call of Duty Zombies story, with our 4 original characters as younger, more nuanced versions of themselves. I personally didn't like this change in story direction, nor do I like the map itself. To suddenly have changed the 4 original characters so drastically from who they once were seemed like such a curveball and annoyingly did not answer the question the community wanted the answer to. I believe Ultimus, the 4 original characters, should have slowly developed into their Origins premise counterparts, rather than focusing on a completely new set of uninteresting characters for the majority of Black Ops 2, and then suddenly changing the original 4. Why the developers decided to change them didn't make sense until you play through the entirety of Black Ops 3 Zombies' story. It still didn't change the fact that this, to me, seemed like a lazy cop-out to attempt to keep the original 4 characters, but tell a different kind of story. And even then, this new narrative direction also has its fair share of issues. How the developers and storytellers linked the events of Origins into the overarching Aether narrative was egregious, and was one of the first major signs of their storytelling incompetence. Instead of it just being its own unique story in a parallel universe or something to that effect, they decided it was an alternate dimension from the Ultimus dimension in which the premise characters were destined to kill their Ultimus counterparts to set things right. But the only way they could do this was to retrieve the Summoning Key, an ancient Eldritch God's artifact, in order to capture their Ultimus souls and send them to Agartha. How the Summoning Key is acquired plays out on a map called Shadows of Evil, the first map in Black Ops 3. Obviously, the developers wanted to make something other than zombies for a change, so they just had a map where both zombies and eldritch monsters fight you at the same time. But the tie-in to the story is outrageous. They decided to break the entire laws of their story and just have Primus Richtofen appear out of the very air to grab the summoning key off of this Eldritch God's hands, explain absolutely nothing to the player, and then just disappear. There's so many things wrong with this that I don't know where to begin. When this map existed in isolation and none of the other maps for Black Ops 3 had been made, I was completely and utterly bewildered at why these eldritch beings existed. Call of Duty Zombies' aesthetic and genre was very much grounded in sci-fi realism with steampunk aesthetical elements. Why we suddenly had high fantasy eldritch monsters in such a story was bizarre to me. If they had simply just not linked the two map stories to each other, maintained the genre and aesthetics, and had not completely and utterly destroyed their own story's laws and physics, I could probably still have followed along from Origins to the Giant relatively unfazed, and even continue to enjoy the story. I'm not against past versions of themselves in an alternate universe using time travel to kill their future selves to save Earth from being decimated. I am, however, against mixing aesthetical elements and introducing universe-breaking elements that do not make sense. In isolation, and if you removed all the eldritch fantasy elements out of Gorod, Krovi, and Der Eisendrache, Black Ops 3's story somewhat manages to stay within the general sci-fi steampunky aesthetic. But having Richtofen appear out of nowhere and grab this eldritch monster's artifact with absolutely no repercussions and no explanation whatsoever was jarring to say the least. And the additions of dragons and magical bows in later maps only served to hammer home this gripe for me. To advance the point of my disdain towards the Keepers and Apothecons, the eldritch monsters I spoke of earlier, their addition into the story feels forced. This was around the time that it seemed the developers wanted to make all their prior excursions into new aesthetical territories contribute something to the story, no matter how arbitrary it was. For example, Mob of the Dead didn't have to actually contribute something to the overarching Aether storyline. It was its own self-contained tale until the developers decided to link it to the main Aether story. And to be honest, it probably should have stayed separate. The same can be said for Shadows of Evil. But sadly, the developers had decided to undertake this task, and so in the final map of Black Ops 3, Revelations, they decided to combine all their aesthetics into one map, and I have to be honest, this is probably the second worst map in Black Ops 3 after Shadows of Evil. Primus's objective in this map is to kill the Shadow Man and return Argatha to its original state. Primus managed to achieve this, however Dr. Monty reveals himself to be the bad guy and tries to erase them from existence. He fails to achieve this, so instead he just decides to trap Primus in a never-ending time loop, destined to repeat their actions starting from the Great War between the Apothicons and Keepers. It is here where the story seems to yet again end, but really it doesn't. By this point there are now 4 questions on the community's mind. What happened to the original 4 characters after Moon? What's the deal with the Apothicons and Keepers? Why are the blood vials significant? And how do we break the cycle? Black Ops 4 Zombies sought to answer all of these questions and wrap up Aether's storyline as quickly as possible because the developers and storytellers were getting kinda bored and wanted to do other stuff, if you can't tell by the Greek mythology stuff on screen. This game was all about retroactively explaining away everything in the story so that there were no loose ends. Though how the developers went about this had to have been the biggest fumble I've ever seen in terms of how a story is handled. They explained Mob of the Dead's connection to the story as it being where Primus gets the blood vials that keep them alive after the events of Black Ops 3. They explain what happened to Ultimus after Moon, but it is the most anticlimactic, boring, and convoluted explanation imaginable. The Richtofen that swaps souls with Samantha somehow makes it back to his original body after Maxis put him in a zombie's body, and when prompted to explain how he did so, he just says,
"Does it matter, Dempsey?"
Like, come on! Broken Arrow gets some expanded lore and the Avogadro gets explained for some reason. I mean, cool, but I don't think that was the most burning question at the time. The Apothicons and Keepers get explained as these 2 cosmic forces that are fighting for control of Argatha, but this was also around the time where all of this lore could only be found outside of the game or through extremely convoluted means that only hardcore dedicated fans would search for. One example of this is the Victis crew from Black Ops 2 Zombies having their fate explained in a comic. They helped Primus Richtofen find the Chronorium, and then were cryogenically frozen by him in Mob of the Dead. If you didn't read this comic, then their appearance in Blood of the Dead, and at the crescendo of the story in Tag der Toten, is absolutely baffling. Lastly, Element 115 gets explained to be this creation conjured up by the Apothicons as an attempt to break free from the Dark Aether, and was sent to 1,000,000 different Earths in 1,000,000 different timelines. This explanation just seems ridiculous compared to it just being an unknown, newly discovered scientific element with a variety of properties that the Germans were going to use to win World War II, which was how it was presented all the way through World War II Black Ops 1 and 2. All of this retroactive reframing of the Aether story's context was done so that the developers could make their previous stuff make sense. Then when the devs tied up their loose ends in the most spectacularly convoluted way possible, they made the characters we cared so much for cease to exist by their own hands, and simply erased the entire universe from existence. It was the most disrespectful slap in the face to these characters, and even despite all of these disappointments along the way, I still cared about these characters' journey. To see it end so anticlimactically made it seem like such a waste of time to have gotten so invested into these characters. Nothing was achieved in the end, no lesson learned, no impactful consequences, just a story that got lost in its own lore to the point where it just had to admit defeat. And so now we come to why this might have happened. The developers on multiple occasions showed that they wanted to get more ambitious with the story's scale, and while Moon certainly was a healthy pinnacle for this, their ambition eventually led them down a slippery slope of adding things that just did not belong in the genre and aesthetic they were originally going for. This in turn made things a nightmare for the storytellers, as it seemed as though they had to adjust to what the developers wanted to do. But they still had a part to play in how the story got so convoluted. They completely failed to end their story on multiple occasions. Moon, Buried, and Revelations were all ending points they could have realistically stopped at, and started up new stories where these ambitions and aesthetics could be actualized in a place where they made sense. In fact, the story technically doesn't even end at Tag der Toten. We see appearances of old maps and characters like Shin Onuma in Vanguard and Edward Richtofen at the end of Cold War's Dark Aether story. So not even the supposed definitive ending of Aether's storyline is an ending. Clearly it's now become a marketing strategy on their part, as they know that the community likes these old maps and how the story used to be, and they're serving these maps and characters as a nostalgia bait to keep us hooked on the zombies mode. Thinking about it more, this very point can be made for story direction decisions as far back as Origins. Rebooting the characters for the sake of trying to extend the story, to sell us more maps and continue to keep us hooked. It's a shame really that Activision's greed slowly corrupted the story into the convoluted mess it has become now. Which is why I decided to take it upon my own hands to offer an alternative direction the story could have gone after the Moon map quest. Bear in mind though that I am a complete amateur at this, and I made it to serve as a method of strengthening my point that the story could have been handled better while sticking to the steampunk sci-fi aesthetic, handling the original character's evolution better, and offering a more satisfying conclusion to the story. So let's jump in. After the events of Moon, Samantha, using her knowledge gained from her time in the MPD, recalibrated the teleporter on the Moon to send her and the rest of Ultimus to the Tag der Toten Lab. But this won't be an exact replica of the one found on Tag der Toten in Black Ops 4. It's far bigger, scaled up to be its own standalone map. Samantha takes Ultimus here in the hopes of reversing the ill effects they have suffered due to Richtofen's mind control experiments and their exposure to Element 115. She and the crew face an issue, however. The facility is not operational, as it requires a power source. As the match progresses, a boss zombie will spawn on round 10. On every subsequent 5 rounds, different bosses will spawn. The order of the bosses is as follows. The Panzer Soldat spawns on round 10, meant to represent Dempsey, as its name translates to tank soldier from German. On round 15, the Russian Mangler spawns, representing Nikolai. However, instead of being very fragile, he's a lot more tanky. And lastly, on round 20, Japanese Banzai zombies spawn. They represent Takeo and are nimble zombies with sharpened bones for arms that will quickly run and hit you before retreating away. The bosses, however, will not die, but instead will retreat, opening different sections of the map that contain Wonder Weapon parts. Once the Wonder Weapon is built, the bosses become killable. However, all boss variations will spawn together on boss rounds thereafter. In order to progress the story, you have to collect elemental substances from the bosses by killing them with the Wonder Weapon. Once one of each is collected, they can be forged to craft one half of the elemental shard. Using the shard to power up the facility temporarily, the crew have to complete a final puzzle of linking the power to the Bacta tanks in order to cleanse Ultimus of their 115 exposure. The consequences of this is that Ultimus begin to slowly revert back to their Primus personalities and think more clearly. though it can be a bit of a running gag throughout the next few maps that their old stereotypical behaviours surface involuntarily and they're all perplexed as to why sometimes they behave that way. After the Tag der Toten laboratory, Ultimus and Samantha teleport themselves to an American Broken Arrow facility. This is where I made some major changes to certain objects and their functions, as here their objective is to retrieve the summoning key. No longer is it an eldritch artifact with immense power, rather it is a device created by Broken Arrow, as somewhat of an upgrade to the Vril device based on research by Group 935 members that defected. It has the ability to store and transfer souls between humanoid vessels, but with a limitation I shall reveal shortly. The facility houses an AI, and in order to progress the map's story, you have to participate in a series of trials. These trials can be things like collecting objects around the map, to surviving an onslaught in a locked-off chamber, and so on. Each trial costs points to participate in, and are located all around the map. Each trial's successful completion will reveal hidden areas in the map that exposes what the intended outcome of such trials was. Mountainous piles of dead, rotting, famished bodies, which makes Dempsey feel especially sickened, as he believed America to be the good guys. Radios around the map will allude to the summoning key only being able to extract souls from subjects if they're sufficiently weakened and exhausted. Hence all the famished and mutilated bodies around the map, hinting at this being what the experiments were testing. Each successive completion of a trial will reward parts of the Wonder Weapon and other equipment which you can build. With a set amount of trials completed, an area opens up where you can attempt to shut down the AI. A code made up of 4 symbols is required to shut it down, and these can be located in random set locations around the map. Inputting them into the console in the order that they were found in causes the AI to flood the facility with toxic gas in a last-ditch effort to exhaust Ultimus. They need to shut down certain cores of the AI in a timed event, with the location of objectives being shown with an icon, similar to how the generators function in Origins. Once the AI is shut down, the summoning key can be acquired from a mainframe in the starting area. From the Broken Arrow facility, the crew used the teleporter to get to an alternate depiction of Zetsubou no Shima, wherein which the facility is not flooded, and the map layout has been altered somewhat. As the crew explores the facility, they discover a temporarily unreachable cave system leading to a source of Argathan energy, which is only accessible through the bunker. The crew's objective on this map is to retrieve the Argathan device and capture the Argathan energy in order to power it. The background lore of this version of Zetsubou is that it was a Division 9 bunker which the Emperor of Japan used to shelter in before the rockets from Moon exploded the Earth. The Emperor survived, but the facility was overrun with zombies, which meant he was trapped. His only escape route is through 2 doors on either side of the room he is in. One side is accessible but takes a bit of traversal to get to, and the other side is overrun by zombies. During the map quest, the Emperor assists in helping the crew find the Argathan device by hinting at what you need to look out for. This leads to a series of hidden puzzles, which involves destroying things or shooting hidden objects in order to acquire the device. Each hint leads to a part of the Wonder Weapon, with the last hint being the location of the Argathan device. Once acquired, the Emperor grants access to the cave, only if in return Ultimus saves him from his predicament. They go to collect the Argathan energy conduit, which weakens Richtofen's hold over Earth, but as they go to leave, the Emperor begs them not to leave him behind. Takeo becomes vocal about wanting to help him, so they attempt to. However, the Emperor notifies them of the difficulty of such a task. For one, the controls to the doors don't operate separately, so if they open one door to get to him, the other door with the zombies behind will open too. Once the controls are repaired through another series of tasks given by the Emperor, all players have to gather in the control room in order to start the end sequence of the map. When the doors open, Ultimus has to run to the room he is in to attempt to rescue him, only to narrowly miss their window of opportunity. The Emperor gets fatally injured amidst the commotion, and a scene plays out similar to the end of Zetsubou in Black Ops 3, where the Emperor commits seppuku and Takeo is granted the honor of being his kaishakunin. Using the teleporter at Zetsubou, Ultimus and Samantha teleport to a unique map in a district within Moscow. This district contains many areas within it, such as a large pub, a family home, military barracks, and a cemetery, each part symbolic of different parts of Nikolai's life. But one area in particular stands out, an Ascension Group power plant. It was used for storing massive amounts of electricity acquired through various unusual means, such as lightning from storms. Upon arrival, the teleporter fries, leaving the crew stranded. The crew can spawn anywhere besides the power plant, and have to make their way to the plant to restore the district's electricity. Their objective in this map is to kill Dr. Ludwig Maxis for the other half of the elemental shard, and the quest begins by interacting with a projector within the power plant. This displays an object somewhere in the map that needs to be destroyed, and within said objects are more projectors. After 3 interactions, a hologram of Nikolai's first wife appears before Ultimus. Nikolai immediately changes his demeanor and is overcome with joy at seeing her. Believing her to still be alive, she states that there isn't much time and asks the crew to realign the facility's exterior antenna dishes to the power plant. This involves shooting them at certain locations around the map to move them into position. Once this is done, players will have to remember where the locations of prior projectors were, as each one includes a step to the quest. The next projector explains that 4 radioactive elements can be found around the map, alongside 3 parts to make the shell of the Wonder Weapon. Each element can be put into the Wonder Weapon to create 4 unique radioactive variants with different destructive properties. These need to be shot at 4 dormant rods in each location of the map. On the next projector, Nikolai's wife informs Ultimus of a secret transmission that came from an unknown location, but in order to decipher it, they need a code hidden in each of the 4 areas. The order in which the numbers are found is the order in which they need to be put into the console within the power plant. Once done, a transmission plays of Ludwig Maxis, noting his intentional destruction of Earth and his plan to completely annihilate it once he takes control of the MPD. This puts Ludwig's statement on Moon that he would not neglect Samantha into a new light, and it visibly hurts her because not only has he lied to her, but he is again neglecting her. Ultimus feel for her and show sympathy for her circumstances, and gain a much stronger resolve to face down these 2 evil men. Nikolai's wife states that the plant must be used to contain the anomaly. Ultimus power up the facility, which then spawns the Avogadro within a chamber. The Avogadro, however, is Maxis in his electrical form. Angered by his extraction from the Moon facility, he begins to attack Ultimus and Samantha. Throughout the fight, he tries to manipulate Samantha into trying to fight Ultimus with promises of being a better father and no longer neglecting her, which she shrugs off, seeing them for what they are. Lies. In order to beat Maxis, the crew has to fill 4 devices in each of the locations with zombie souls, which releases an EMP blast when full. This weakens Maxis enough for him to be able to take damage. Once an EMP blast hits Maxis and he has taken enough damage, the soul box is destroyed. Once killed, he drops the other half of the elemental shard. As the crew consolidates Samantha, who is somewhat saddened by her father's death, Nikolai listens to the final projection of his wife, who addresses the message to Nikolai himself. She admits to have worked with the Ascension Group and apologizes for keeping it a secret from him. She goes on to mention there is an experimental contraption hidden in a secret compartment, the contraption being the Gersh device. She hopes that this information does not shock him or make him love her any less, and finishes the message by saying that she loves him, to which the message ends. Nikolai, having realized that the messages were actually pre-recorded, breaks down in tears. Samantha and Ultimus use the Gersh device left behind by Nikolai's wife to teleport themselves to Griffin Castle, otherwise known as the Eisendrache or Eagle's Nest, but without the Eldritch and Dragon elements. The crew's objective is to kill Richtofen and destroy the MPD. Upon reaching the facility, they reach the underground area where the bow pedestals were. But instead of the bow pedestals, however, they're the podiums for the elemental staffs from Origins. Above that area is a teleporter on the ceiling. Ultimus and Samantha need to build the staffs in order to power the teleporter. Once it is powered, they attempt to teleport the MPD from Moon, only to find that Griffin Station systems are preventing the MPD from being teleported. This starts an alternate objective where the rocket needs to be primed with an EMP and refueled, alongside building a detonation device to send the rocket to the Moon and detonate it to shut down Griffin Station's defense system. Once that happens, the crew need to reactivate the teleporter with the staffs in the podiums, which brings the MPD to Eagle's Nest. From here, 2 sets of apparatus drop down from the ceiling, one of which is a holding contraption for the Argarthan device, and the other allowing for the containment of the elemental shard. There are 2 sets of controls at opposing ends of the room that have to be used to rotate the 2 contraptions around the sides of the room until they align in front of the MPD. Once they do, a beam will fire out of the Argarthan device through the elemental shard and into the middle of the MPD, where the Vril sphere once sat. This forces the MPD to open once again. The Argarthan device deactivates after the MPD opens, and it is here where the 4 soul canisters emerge from the MPD. The crew have to fill it with souls once more, then place the summoning key into where the Vril sphere was. This will then trigger a boss fight, which pulls the souls of Ultimus and Samantha into the MPD, yet they remain on the map. Richtofen will attempt to obviously resist being pulled out of the MPD, and will start teleporting around the castle, summoning large amounts of zombies at his given location. The crew must shoot him with a particular elemental staff in order to break his invincibility. Shooting him will then make him teleport around the area he is in until he's been shot enough times to make him teleport to a new part of the map. This repeats for each element of the staves until he goes back to the MPD. He must be shot with all 4 staves in quick succession to break his last invincibility barrier, and shot enough to trigger the final cutscene, where Ultimus's souls get put back into their bodies and they extract Richtofen and his soul from the MPD. Ultimus then used the summoning key to place Samantha and Richtofen's souls in their respective bodies. Once Richtofen realizes what's going on, he tries to run for the MPD, but is stopped by Dempsey, Takeo, and Nikolai, who push him away and angrily question his betrayal. After Richtofen provides insufficient reasonings and hurtful insults, Samantha shoots Richtofen straight in the head, to all of Ultimus's surprise. They destroy the MPD and summoning key by overloading the Argarthan device and elemental shard, expending all of their power and becoming nothing more than a rock and an artifact. After the events that have transpired and looking out to space from a broken Earth, the crew question how things will proceed from where they are now, and theorize what Earth's future looks like. As they walk off together into the wilderness, Nikolai jokes that he's going to need a whole lot of vodka to process what happened to them all, and as the laughter fades, so does the screen. Now, I understand this is probably a very amateurish alternate story that likely isn't the best, but I hope it serves to show how repurposing some aspects of the ideas they had in the original story, and changing how some items function in their origin of creation, could have spawned a much better story with a more satisfying ending for Ultimus and Samantha. Sure, there's some open-ended questions about what the future of a broken Earth might look like, but at the very least, the important parts of the story are neatly tied up to allow for experimentation in other avenues of storytelling storytelling and genre aesthetics, instead of forcing each individual story deviation featuring a celebrity cast to contribute to the main story. Which is why I find it so disappointing to see the way zombies developed over the years. Instead of a consistent story that did not overstay its welcome and wrap things up before it got too complex, it did the opposite. So much so to the point it had to explain all its loose ends outside of the games, and then self-destruct itself unceremoniously to forcibly create an ending. The Aether story was done dirty in my eyes, and it's a shame its potential was wasted. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and found some of its points interesting. Let me know what you think about the Call of Duty Zombies story down in the comments. Shout out to my Patreons over on Patreon. Your contribution to the show is infinitely appreciated. Liking and sharing the video around is also just as much appreciated. And if you hit that subscribe button, then I shall likely see you in the next video. And now I am going to vanish into the very air. I hate this fucking map! Oh my god! It sucks so bad! Oh my god, man.
Sellout show tonight, huh?
What? What? Oh, what the f happened there? It was its own. I've turned into a zombie from Call of Duty now. This game was all about retroactively explaining away everything in the story so that they go to collect the Agarthan energy conduit, which we fucking reckons Wicktoffen. Once the controls are repaired through another series of tasks,